The tale of William de Braose is one of loyalty, murder, treachery and tragedy. At his height, he was the favourite of the king, and at his lowest, he had a part in the slaying of young Arthur of Brittany. I am not going to gloss over facts. De Braose was a brute, a nasty man, brutal even for his time. This is a dark tale, and it begins in the mid-12th century during the civil war known as the Anarchy, where the kingdom was divided across many lands, as Stephen fought Matilda for control over the English throne. At an unknown date, somewhere between 1144 and 1154, William was born into the de Braose family. They were quite distinguished, having originally hailed from Braose in Normandy, and coming over in the Norman conquest of 1066. And since then, under the reign of William the Conqueror, the family had become a line of marcher lords, military commanders who guarded the borders between England and Wales. Powerful men. His father was also called William. He is the third Lord of Bramber. His mother was Bertha of Hereford, daughter to the Earl of Hereford. The Welsh lands, controlled by the de Braose household, were based around Abergavenny, namely the castle at Llantilio, the White Castle. Actually, a quick note on Wales. It is not the unified country we see today. It's divided into several smaller kingdoms, concentrated in the north and centre. These kingdoms were led by princes who ruled in a similar manner to the Saxon kings of England in the early medieval period. Though I'll also say that the title prince had no connection whatsoever with the son of the English king and queen. It was not the heir to the English throne. It was an evolution of the Latin term princeps, meaning chief, or leader, even king. So men like Owain Gwynedd would be considered equal to King Henry II and Malcolm of Scotland. And the south of Wales was the occupied territory ruled by the marcher lords, who pretty much dominated the area. So there we have that. But the de Braose household didn't just have lands in the Welsh marshes. Now in England, they were known as the Lords of Bramber, Bramber being a domain over in Sussex. And the household has much more than just this. As I said, they were very powerful men. Like many, nothing is written about William's childhood and upbringing. But being the son of a baron, we know he'd lived a life of luxury, at least in comparison to many others of this era. Learning scripture, Latin, games like chess. As he got older, he would have learned other skills, like the running of a military household. And before he was 10, he would have no doubt had spent his time at one of the many castles that acted as boarding schools for young knights, pretty much. Places such as Château de Tonquerville, where William Marshal grew up. Now, I'm not suggesting that de Braose was at Tonquerville. I am just giving it as an example of one such castle where young boys would learn to train and hopefully one day grow up into knights errant. I'll also mention that de Braose and the Marshal could be pretty much the same age, as we don't really know when de Braose was born. Could be 1140s, could be 1150s. So he and the Marshal may be around the same age. More likely the Marshal is a bit older, as he's born around 1146. And they certainly shared the same sort of social circles, at least in their adulthood. But if the Marshal's history is anything to go by, then de Braose would have cut his teeth in the famous tournament circuits of Normandy, because pretty much everyone was at it. But again, nothing really is known, and we can only piece together the kinds of events that others were doing. For all we know, he could have stayed this whole time in Bramber, Llantilio, and Abergavenny, which all belonged to his father. Okay, Abergavenny technically belonged to his mother Bertha, but the Lord of Bramber is the head of the household, hence belongs to his father. And it's a recent acquisition too, because Abergavenny was a part of the domain of the Earl of Hereford. But the last Earl, Roger Fitzmiles, had died without an heir. So the earldom was dissolved, and Bertha's brother, Henry Fitzmiles, had become the Baron of Abergavenny. Right. Now, in the 1160s, there was a conflict in Wales, and Henry Fitzmiles was murdered by one of the Welsh rebels. And the finger was pointed at a lord by the name Cecil ap Dyfnwal. And William de Braose would vow to avenge the death of his uncle. In around 1166, William de Braose had married a Norman noblewoman by the name of Matilda of Saint-Valery, around the same region from where William the Conqueror supposedly assembled his troops prior to his conquest. Matilda was also known as Maud, a popular shortening of the name, and she was also known as Lady of the Hay, after de Braose put her in charge of Hay Castle in Powys, Wales. And given we don't truly know how old William was, we don't know his age around this marriage. He could be anywhere between 20 to 10, probably somewhere between. Matilda was only around 12. And again, I stress, we cannot judge the past by our own standards. The past is a foreign place. They did things differently there. This was the norm, and noble marriages were politically charged anyway. It was the unification of two powerful noble households. They didn't marry because he fancied them. And over the years, he and Matilda would have 9 children. Quite a sizable number. And the eldest is a boy called William, and the youngest being Flanderina. The situation between the Welsh princes and the Marcher lords had always been tense. Deals had been struck, then broken, and fighting had been relatively constant. There had also been a lot of infighting with the various Welsh factions, who were far from one united group. They often had grudges with other princes harking back long before the Norman invasion. Other times you had wars of succession, like in 1170 when things escalated out of control. Owen Griffith, the Prince of Wales, had died, and his sons, Hill and Dafydd, were tearing the kingdom apart in a civil war. A short and brutal conflict that spilled out into Ireland and resulted in Dafydd killing not only his brother but his nephews, that were picked off one by one over a 4-year period. Dafydd ap Owain was now Prince of Wales. Now, during this time, William de Braose seems to have been living in the region of Abergavenny, and in 1172 he bolsters the defences of the castle there, expanding it and building much stronger walls. Not that it helped, as William's old rival, Cecil ap Dynfwal, raids the castle at Abergavenny, overpowering the new defences and capturing it. Though he is swiftly driven off by de Braose retreating back to nearby Castell Arnech. And over the next couple of years, de Braose will be plotting the revenge of his uncle, payback for the taking of this castle. And I will mention, before we get into the next part, that William is probably only in his 20s and not the head of the household. That title belongs to his father, the third Lord of Bramber. But during all these troubles in, say, the mid-1170s, our William is certainly stationed in Wales. Now, traditionally, in medieval Wales, Christmas was a period where rival lords can meet together without fear of retribution. The idea being that such a holy time might bring peace and reconciliation. And around 1175, as Christmas approached, William de Braose extended his arms in friendship and invited Cethlech and his sons, and all the important princes in the region, to his castle at Abergavenny, which the Welsh gladly accepted. The hope being there would be peace in the region. But of course, de Braose had no intention of peace. His mind was bent on revenge. Before the Welsh faction arrived, he had weapons hidden outside the castle, where they could be easily accessed by his garrison. So when the feasting was underway, and the wine flowing freely, William de Braose put his plan into action. He ordered his men to gather their weapons, and once they were ready, the large oak doors to the feasting hall were slammed and barred shut. Then the Abergavenny massacre began. The Welsh faction was unarmed and could only watch in panic as they were cut down mercilessly by the soldiers of the de Braose household. Cethlech was slain, and his son, in an act of bloody murder. Soon the entire Welsh faction lay dead, dozens killed, not a single one spared. For this act of butchery, William de Braose was known as the Ogre of Abergavenny. But the slaughter did not stop there. Because Cecil was clever, or at least he thought so, and made sure his youngest son, Cadwalder, only 7 years old, had stayed back at his Welsh castle. But alas, de Braose hunted the boy down and ended his life. Age meant nothing to the massacre, the killing indiscriminate. It's brutal even for the 12th century. King Henry II appears to be outraged by this. The last thing he wants is a full-scale Welsh rebellion in the region. So, for his son's crimes, he withdraws royal favour to the elder de Braose in the hope of mitigating the inevitable violence that soon erupted. And the elder, the third Lord of Bramber, seems to retire to his Sussex estates around now, and he passes away around 1179, leaving our William as the fourth Lord of Bramber. Unfortunately, this would not be the last stain on the character of William de Braose, and it would not be the last time that he annoyed a king. The hostilities raged on in Wales, not just because of the massacre, and there were many other factors, like Dafydd usurping Gwynedd. But the massacre certainly drove the desire for Welsh revenge against de Braose. And in 1182, Hwyl ap Owyddyth, the Lord of Caerleon, laid the castle at Abergavenny to siege. Successfully taking it, he captured the governor and left the castle in flames. It was retaken and later reinforced. Now I introduced him as Hywel ap Eorwerth, and Eorwerth was the son of Owain, but is not related to the chaps with the same name I'll be dealing with in a minute. It's just a very popular name, Owain and Eorwerth. This Eorwerth is the Prince of Gwynllw, and that's only a stone's throw from Abergavenny. But Eorwerth's son, Hywel, has been defeated, and that's that. Now, William's fortunes would change for the better when the crown passed to Henry's son, Richard Coeur de Lion, of the Lionheart, and William would spend most of the 1190s as the Sheriff of Herefordshire, rising in the ranks. But he's not the only one to rise in the ranks, as that civil war that happened in Wales in the 1170, when the V rose and killed his brother and wresting control of Gwynedd and calling himself Prince of Wales. You see, it's not just his brother, the other Hywel, who was slain. Dafydd also went on to war with his other brothers, scattering their forces and leaving another brother dead, the other Eorwerth, the broken-nosed. Well, that's now 20-odd years ago, and once again, rebellion is about to erupt, because Eorwerth had a son, Llywelyn. And Llywelyn is the one who rises up with his own forces, in direct confrontation with his usurping uncle Dafydd. And this young man, the son of Eorwerth, is a magnificent general. He's only around 20 years of age. He utterly crushes the usurper's forces at the Battle of Abergavenny, driving Dafydd from the land, where he is captured, then slung into prison. And Llywelyn takes his grandfather's title, the Prince of Wales. And in case you're wondering, yes, this is the famous Llywelyn the Great, and he'll have a long reign of over 40 years. Anyway, back to Braose. Although he doesn't appear to have participated in the Third Crusade, he certainly went with Richard the Lionheart to Normandy in 1195, as war had broken out once again between England and France. These are the famous wars between the Lionheart and King Philip of France. It's also around the time that John Lackland, the king's brother, sets his eyes on the throne back in England. The war with France went on for several years, and William de Braose was with the king at the siege of Chaluz, where the Lionheart was felled by a bolt from a crossbow that would ultimately prove fatal. In April 1199, at Chaluz in Normandy, Richard I is on his deathbed, and William de Braose is one of the people there. He's one of the magnates who confirmed that the Lionheart had named his brother John as the heir to the kingdom, not Arthur of Brittany. Actually, about Arthur of Brittany, he's only in his mid-teens. He's John Lackland's nephew, the son of Geoffrey, a Duke of Brittany. But Geoffrey had died many years ago, and now Arthur's mother, Constance, had married the Earl of Chester, Ranulph de Blondeville. It was an English bid to keep the domain of Brittany, but it was a long shot. Relations were always tense, and Brittany tended to have more in common with France than England. So there was genuine discussion about how to bypass John as the heir, as John always got on the wrong side of Richard, even trying to usurp the throne, plus succession was never guaranteed to be the next male in line. But Arthur's ties with Philip of France lost him the job. So John is sworn in as king. And at Chaluz, de Braose also swore loyalty to John when he arrived there. The fallen king was then buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou. Many were there, including William de Braose, hoping to obtain John's favour, because, as we know, de Braose was ambitious and took any road that furthered his career. And on a side note, by now, de Braose's southern neighbour on the Welsh border was the legendary knight William Marshal. He's a lot older now. His castle was nearby Strigil, Shepstow. Both were making well out of the situation of this new king, John. And King John treated them very well, giving them plenty of lands, including his old family claim to Limerick in Ireland. De Braose is also granted the bailiff of Glamorgan. Sure, it puts de Braose into huge debt, and John was known for bestowing huge taxes on inheritances, but it was worth it, as de Braose was rising high up in the royal court, alongside the Marshal. And when, in the opening years of the 13th century, Theobald Walter has his lands restored, and it was de Braose who acted as regent. In 1202, once again there was conflict between England and France, and once again William de Braose fought alongside his king, this time John, at the Battle of Mirabeau. Basically, King Philip of France had struck from the north, and around the same time Arthur, who's only around 15, struck from the south, invading Anjou with his Breton forces. Together, the rebel Hugh de Lusignan and the young Arthur of Brittany besieged the town of Mirabeau, intent on capturing the castle where the king's mother resided, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The news forced King John into a rage, and by the time John learned of this, the rebels had breached the outer defences of the town, pushing deeper towards the castle. They had filled the gates up with earth and dirt so no one could get in or out, all except one gate, which they left for aid and supplies. King John was on the move, and he left to Le Mans with his forces that included William de Roche and William de Braose, covering an 80-mile journey in just 2 days. Quite a feat, for an army in the Middle Ages especially. On the 1st of August, all was calm. It was a fine morning. Hugh de Lusignan and Arthur were dining. They ate pigeons, good wood pigeons, hunted locally. And their troops were getting ready for another day of siege. It was another regular, ordinary day. Until the army of King John descended upon them. Swiftly, they fell beneath the king's onslaught. The armed and unarmed were cut down in equal measure. It was not so much a battle, this was a massacre. There, William personally caught the young Arthur of Brittany and dragged him to the king. Around 200 other knights were also captured, alongside Hugh de Lusignan. The battle was done. But more importantly, Queen Eleanor was safe. But the 200 survivors would receive a brutal punishment under John's command. They were first chained and paraded as trophies, before being slung in prisons and simply starved to death. But while Hugh de Lusignan had managed to broker a deal and gain his freedom, the young Arthur of Brittany, on the other hand, was imprisoned at Fleet Castle and placed under the protection of William de Braose. Now, according to Ralph of Coggeshall, some of the magnates wanted to have the young lad castrated and blinded. Horrible punishment. But when 3 knights arrived at Falaise to commit the act, Hubert de Burgh protected Arthur and sent the scoundrels off. Rumours of the lad's treatment certainly circled. Dark rumours. And by 1203, Arthur was moved to another location, Rouen Castle, most likely by William de Braose himself, who was the guardian of the young man. All this went on for a few months, until the April of 1203, when suddenly de Braose relinquished his guardianship of Arthur, telling John he could no longer be his guardian, and that he was no longer responsible if anything happened to him. "I do not know the fate that awaits your nephew, who I have been faithful as a guardian to," says de Braose. "I return him to your hands, good in health. I pray you'll put him in some other custody. My burden of affairs bids me resign." Very strange. Was he aware that John was planning something sinister and wanted no part in it? Was it de Braose who was planning a dastardly deed? To this day we don't know. We can only speculate what happened next. But it is the last we ever see of the lad. Arthur of Brittany simply vanishes from historical record. Was he murdered? Set free? Escaped? What happened? We don't know. But the de Braose family had ties to a certain monastery, who kept record of what may have happened, written in the Annals of Margam. It claims that King John had been stewing over all of this, and it all starts on the Thursday before Easter at Rouen on the 3rd of April 1203. Yes, they even named the day. They are very specific. That night, King John got absolutely drunk with wine, and as they say, he was possessed of the devil. He sought out to harm Arthur, which he did, slaying the lad with his own hands by crushing his skull with a rock. Then the body was weighed down and thrown into the River Seine. A dastardly deed. The Cistercian monks then go on to say that the body was in fact discovered by some fishermen who recognised the body, that of Arthur, and they took him to the Notre-Dame-des-Prés, a priory in Bec, out of the eyes of the tyrant king. But is this tale true? It would be damning if it was true. I mean, we are quick to blame Richard III for the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, but King John seems to get a free pass when it comes down to Arthur, and at the very least, Arthur disappeared in his custody. Plus, following this, John forbade anyone to speak of Arthur, especially William de Braose. More proof of his guilt. There is even a letter written by John addressed to his mother Eleanor that hints of a deed done that they would both be familiar with. So did Eleanor know? Or was this something completely different? How deep, if at all, did this conspiracy go? Something very horrid is going on here. And it happened in an age where life was cheap. And when John needed to rid the world of the next man in line for the English throne, he didn't hesitate to act. And a very ambitious William de Braose most certainly had his part to play in this, whether he killed Arthur or not. The Ogre of Abergavenny certainly knew what had happened, and he was also suspected of having been complicit from the start. And remember that William de Braose absolutely killed the Welsh princes and the 7-year-old boy. He didn't become the Ogre of Abergavenny for nothing. He didn't do it by playing tiddlywinks. He's a brute, a scoundrel. And this event also gave the French king, Philip Augustus, an extra excuse to really hammer the continental lands, bent on wresting them from the English. In 1204, de Braose joins King John in the fight against Philip of France, who is razing town after town, bent on driving the English from the continent. But there's nothing that John, de Braose, or anyone can do. The French won battle after battle, pressing onto the Vexin, historical Norman lands, and sieging the last bastion of defence for the Normans, Chateau Gaillard. This would be a long siege, but they fought to the long defeat. When the castle eventually fell, so did Normandy, and all John's hopes for the continental lands. Of course, some barons managed to make deals with the French, much to John's annoyance, but de Braose seems to be content with his holdings in the British Isles, at a time when the Normans were mostly cut off from Normandy. But unfortunately, de Braose's ambitions were far too great. He may have even considered himself a bit of a kingmaker, having sworn for John on Richard's deathbed. But he also had many outstanding debts, and had pledged even more in a bid to extend his holdings. There was also the looming question of what happened to Arthur. Plus, King John was becoming increasingly paranoid and growing highly suspicious of his lieutenants, and barons like William de Braose and the Marshal are no exception to this. The king is waxing hot and cold. In around 1205, both the Marshal and de Braose are on the receiving end of John's wrath. Both the magnates had fallen from grace. They're not in the king's good books, so to speak. De Braose is stripped of his title of Bailiff of Glamorgan in Wales. The Marshal lost lands also. Replacing these two naughty men were Girard of Athy and Fawkes de Brou, upcoming stars among the magnates. But the trouble really starts over in Ireland, because over there, some magnates had acquired Irish lands, mostly due to their losses in Normandy. You had Walter de Lacy in Meath, William Marshal in Leinster, and William de Braose in Limerick. And then you had Justiciar Fitzhenry, who's in charge of the lot. Now, de Braose is off to a bad start, because his seneschal there, Geoffrey Marsh, is causing arguments with de Lacy, and this needs to be sorted out by Milo Fitzhenry. He's an old-school Norman with generations of his family having lived in Ireland, and is not a fan of these upstarts getting compensated from losing land on the continent. Fitzhenry is not keen on sharing power, and soon conflict breaks out. He pushes into the lands of de Braose, taking Limerick, and soon all four magnates were embroiled in a scrap. John wants all this to end, so summons the Marshal, de Braose and de Lacy to Woodstock in England. But in reality, he's teaching them a lesson, because while over in England, they are powerless to stop Fitzhenry rampaging through the other rivals' lands on a command from King John, who wants to unite the whole of Ireland. This story I've also covered in episode 7 of my series on King John. Basically, while de Braose, the Marshal and de Lacy were away in England, 3 knights from the Marshal household continued the fight against Fitzhenry, and the Marshal's wife Isabella also weighed in, and Fitzhenry was captured. This and a lot more, like general opposition to John's rule, meant that the king is as paranoid as ever. He begins demanding hostages from all the magnates. Many do, some don't. Again, the issue of Arthur is brought up. How can you trust your sons with John when he slew his own nephew in cold blood? And one of these magnates refusing John's command was Braose. What could he do? He's up to his neck in this. He still owes John a lot of money, and there is much controversy with the king, including the death of Arthur. Worse, his wife Maud openly blames the king for the death of Arthur. She refuses to be silent any longer. With the walls closing in, Braose's best bet is to hide away in Wales and wait for the king to calm down, as he has done so in the past. Only things would not simmer down. There's defiance all around, and John by now is the tyrant everyone feared he'd be, and the accusations from Maud cannot go unpunished. By 1208, the king had not only managed to offend the barons, but the Pope, who places a religious interdict on the kingdom. Eventually, John's excommunicated. This is the period where John is looting the churches and monasteries. He's utterly out of control. While Braose hides away in Wales, the king seizes his estates in England, namely Devon and Sussex. But John isn't done with the Ogre of Abergavenny. No. He then sends an army into Wales with the sole intention of seizing the Welsh lands also, as well as locating Maud and silencing her accusations. But the king is also preparing to invade France, determined to wrest Normandy from King Philip, and the important magnates are busy mustering for this campaign. So in a moment of madness, Braose opens a rebellion against the king. If he's going to go down, he'll go down fighting. Immediately, he and his two sons, William and Reginald, begin to retake their lands. Or at least they try. They don't stand a chance. Gerard d'Athie, the Sheriff of Hereford, proves too much of an opponent. Plus, Braose's troops are already deserting, and the loyalty to the king paramount. So, after accomplishing nothing, Braose burns half of Leominster to the ground and flees with his family to Ireland. The journey was wrought with storms, and, with hindsight, maybe the fallen magnate would have wished the sea had claimed them there and then. But instead they made it to Ireland, where they found John's forces hot on their heels. There'd be no respite here either. And, to make things worse, Braose's Welsh lands are given to Piers Fitzherbert, who proves controversial and provokes aggression from Gwynwynwyn of Powys. In Ireland, Braose tries to seek refuge in the Marshal's lands, while trying to ally with Walter de Lacy at the same time. But apparently the king had such hatred for Braose, there could be no peace, at least according to the Marshal. Thus, he could not help the fallen magnate. But de Lacy could, as de Lacy was having his own trouble with the king, accusations of treachery and colluding with the French, which appear to be true. So, while the Braose family are safely harboured in the de Lacy lands, Braose decides to sue for peace with the king. And yes, the king does allow Braose to sail back over the Irish Sea to Wales, where he can grovel. Maybe there could be peace after all. Well, no, because Braose simply cannot help himself. He's not a nice guy. because the second he arrives in Wales, he pallies up with Llywelyn the Great, who is having an uprising of his own against John. It doesn't last long, and de Braose realises his mistake and gets back to grovelling. He's really trying the king's patience. Of all the kings he could try the patience of, King John would be the last he'd want to do it to. But an offer of 40,000 marks might sweeten the deal. After all, John needs the money to fund his war against France, plus other shenanigans like de Lacy. But when this 40,000 mark deal falls through, let's face it, de Braose doesn't have the money. He's in debt. And knowing he cannot get back to Ireland, he has no choice but go to ground and hide in Wales. A difficult rabbit to catch. Or so he thought, because John knows how to hunt. He's good at it. He heads an army to the de Lacy stronghold over in Ireland, crossing the Irish Sea. And there, along with the Marshal, he invades de Lacy's lands, taking castle after castle after castle. All this is kicking off in 1210. And as for the de Lacys, they start having an internal squabble, blaming each other, before going their separate ways and fleeing, following a battle at Carrickfergus. Everything was over. The king had won. Now Reginald, the youngest son of the de Braose household, along with some of the de Lacys, namely Hugh, managed to flee in time, getting a boat to Galloway, before making their way to France. And there they unite with the rest of the de Lacy household, namely Walter and his lot. So far so good. But the rest of the de Braose household, his wife Maud, their son William and his children, are captured by the king. They only fled as far as the Isle of Man before getting found, and then they're slung in a prison in an attempt to lure out William de Braose. The children of William are released, along with his wife. So it's just Maud, aka Matilda, and the son William, who are in this prison. And the father, de Braose, knew he couldn't fall for the trap. He understood John's cruelty more than anyone, so instead of handing himself over, he rose up once more against the king, allying once more with Llywelyn the Great in one last attempt at defiance. But unfortunately, this rebellion is crushed by the efforts of Ranulph de Blondeville of Chester and William Longsby of Salisbury. They used a scorched earth policy, and the Welsh prince is utterly defeated. De Braose has nowhere to run and is out of allies. Defeated, William de Braose finally hands himself over to King John to save his family, along with 50,000 marks negotiated by Matilda, Maud, his wife. But then de Braose does something rather rash. Instead of adhering to this deal, one job, he gives his guards the slip and flees to France dressed as a beggar. What a pig! Now Maud and William are slung into prison. Either Corfe Castle or Windsor, we do not know for fact. But when they are there, they are starved to death for 11 days. Mother and son, fed nothing, not even water. Young William, only around 20, died first. When the guards opened the cell, they found he had his back up against the cell. His mother Maud, also dead, had tried, in the last stages of hunger, to chew his cheek. Failed effort at cannibalism. Awful death. Finally, King John had his revenge. William de Braose had run foul of a bigger monster. And in France, William de Braose heard of this terrible news he collapses in grief. He'd never recover. He'd die not long after, in 1211. But not before telling his side of the story, that the king was the murderer of Arthur. And in doing so, he confirms what King Philip of France had suspected all along. The Frenchman just needed to hear it from an English source to back it up. But the repercussions of all this would be dire for King John. He's an excommunicated king at this point. He's just tried to destroy two noble households who'd served the country since the Conqueror, all because he wanted to rid himself of the heir to the throne, because at that point, that's what Arthur would have been. John would never recover, and the fall of Braose was just one more nail in the coffin of absolute rule. In just a few short years, the barons would demand the king to sign Magna Carta, and when he got it annulled, they went to war with him. The First Barons' War. John would die, fighting his barons, in 1216, of dysentery, after losing the crown in the Wash, a fitting end to a tyrant. The de Braose family itself would continue in the form of Reginald, who'd strive to regain the family land, and eventually this happens. You've got the daughters, as well as the children of the younger William. But all that is another story. For now, the story of the Ogre of Abergavenny is over. Thank you for watching.